So when we look at the changes that are actually happening in the body, it's going to happen amongst this hierarchy, the human movement system, which this slide comes out quite a bit with us in this class and these lectures. And it's really looking at that at the bottom there you see movement, and movement is what we're trying to improve. We're trying to increase our functional capacity. We're using the tools of movement to elicit those stress responses, whether we're at high intensity or low intensity. And that's a product of the movements occurring at the articular system, so the bones, the joints, the ligaments. The muscles are in 100% control of those joints, and the nervous system is 100% in control of those muscles. And so when you see any kind of adaptations or improvement in your ability to move, it's coming from one of these three tiers. And so we look at neural adaptations first because it's at the top of the hierarchy there. And you have many tiers to the nervous system. And you can have central adaptations like the motor cortex in terms of the programming that's there, more of the software type components, the changes in signaling that can happen. You have the adaptations of the motor units, so how the body recruits those motor units. Does it recruit these four fibers first and then those motor units? And then we looked at how the body sends the go signal. Is it sending it in rapid succession? Is it timed appropriately so it can maximize the tetanus of the contraction? You'll get neuromuscular changes in terms of the muscle spindle and the reflex aspect. So if we go back a couple slides, this feedback mechanism here, this feedback mechanism is dependent upon the proprioception. And if the proprioception is off, you're going to have impaired muscle neuromuscular efficiency. And if that proprioception improves, like it would with time or with stability and so forth, you'll see an increase in that force and that muscle generation force output. And you get actual structural changes within the tissues themselves, right? The neuromuscular junction, the storage of neurotransmitter, and the more robust connections so that signal can come down as fast as possible. And so we forget that sometimes that our nervous system is a large driver of the strength. And we've talked about in many aspects that the neuromuscular system doesn't exist without the nervous or the muscular, right? It's actually one. We look at the nervous system by itself, the muscular system by itself for research or for studying, but they're inseparable. The muscle is nothing without the nervous system. The nervous system can't do anything without the muscles. And so when we look at our strength output, as I had talked about in a previous lecture, that some even argue that more than 50% of your total force output, your ability to do strength, is driven by the nervous system, by all the things that we looked here, and that the muscle is just the other 50% of that, maybe smaller. And so when we look at our improvements over time, you'll see that it is a factor of both neural factors and muscle factors, tissue strength as well. And you'll see that neuromuscular changes account for more of the aspects early on. So when you look at why someone gets stronger, it's usually initially because of the neurological adaptations. Your protein synthesis, the increased in the cross fiber areas, the increased muscle hypertrophy cross-sectional area. Tissue adaptations take 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, right? And your neural changes can happen within seconds. Your body can find a new pathway right away. And you see this in the gym. You'll see people that'll try a first rep, first set, and they're shaking and they're all over the place with like 5-pound dumbbells. And then they do their second rep and it was like so much smoother, their second set. And then let's try 10 pounds. They'll double their weight. And it had nothing to do with the muscles changing. What it had to do was that any one of these neural factors here, usually in the motor cortex, some changes here. These things change pretty quickly. There's not a lot of tissue change that needs to happen, but you can see that midpoint through that, after that 6 to 8 week period, and then for many years, you get these tissue adaptations. When you look at your really advanced athletes, most of these have already maximized their tissue. You can see that this kind of happens, rapid increase, and then it gets to plateau. When you see really big gains in competitive athletes that have been training for at least 5 years or more, I would say even 2 or 3 years or more, most of it's neurological adaptations. Are you forcing the body to be able to tap into more its reserve, more psychological adaptations, and overcoming some of the natural inhibitions that happen from that? The other thing we look at is the motor unit, and we see that remember that when we look at the smaller type 1 slow twitch versus the slow type 2 fibers, that you get better communication of these motor neurons, and we'll talk more about the fiber adaptations in terms of the muscle, but your type 1 fibers always recruit more before your type 2. There's some evidence that in advanced lifters that they can recruit some of those type 2, but really what's happening, and this is kind of back here with these advanced training, is that you are forcing your body, teaching your body how to recruit more and more of these reserve fibers, these really big type 2 fibers. Those are like your just in case. So let's say you're an amateur or intermediate type marathon runner, and you just get done running a race, you're exhausted, so you think. But if you had a big enough stimulus, a big enough sympathetic aspect at that point, your body still had some reserves left over in case like a tiger jumped out. You would be able to sprint pretty fast even though you were exhausted. So your body keeps this reserve capacity. I'm sure you've heard stories of people, babies being trapped and mothers coming in and like they're able to jump over a wall or lift up a car. Well, it's all within the body's ability. It's just how often do we does the body say tap into those resources? And so that's what's happening here, is that as you get more advanced in your training, you're tapping more and more into those advanced resources. So then we move away from the nervous system. We look at the next tier. We look at the muscular system, and this is where we're going to be discussing our muscle hypertrophy. And remember, we talked in the last lectures that muscle hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the number of fibers, and not so much the hyperplasia where you're getting increased number of muscle fibers. And we said that is possible with some kind of trauma or stress, but it's not a normal product of our functioning. And so when you look at your strength outputs, it is related to this increased neuromuscular efficiency. You're getting hypertrophy, and not so much the muscle fibers are going through the number of changes, but you're getting the myofibril hypertrophy. Within that myofibril, you're getting the myofilament, more proteins being laid down there. But those aren't necessarily cells, so that's not really going through hyperplasia. That's just increased proteins packed into the tissue. And then you can also get hypertrophy that is more from the sarcoplasma. The cell size is getting bigger because of more fluid and more things stored in there, but you're not getting increase in contractile elements. So remember, cross-sectional area is one of the biggest contacts for strength output, and it's because you have more available opportunity for cross-bridging. So when you have a bigger cross-sectional area, you have more actin and myosin in there, you have more cross bridges, more force potential. So this muscle is going to be stronger than this muscle is going to be stronger than that muscle. When we look at changes over time at different these tiers, we expect an increase in muscle size thickness. We also expect an increase in fiber diameter. So remember, you have your number of fibers here and the number of fibers there. They didn't change, they got bigger. And inside each of those fibers, we would expect an increase in density of those myofibrils because you have increased myofilaments in there. So you're getting more contractile elements. And so when you look at most tissue changes, you either can go the route of hypertrophy or you can go hyperplasia, but we don't know if hyperplasia really occurs, and if it does, is it really a benefit? It might be an injury. More think of active scar tissue. But we do know that we definitely get hypertrophy. You'll get increase in myofibril size, and you get an increase in the sarcoplasma, stuff packed in there. And you can't really pick one or the other, but you get both. So the muscle fibers are getting bigger, and it's a product of more stuff in the fiber and more filaments in those individual fibers. You have the hypertrophy happening, and one of the interesting things is that you have multiple nuclei within the muscle fiber. And as I shared in a previous lecture, that with adaptive training over time, you don't necessarily have stem cells, but you have these satellite cells that contain nuclei. And if you think of these as factories that produce protein, the more of these you have, the more proteins you can kick out, the faster those tissue adaptations, because you're getting more protein filaments, more myosin, more actin for production. So when we look at the muscular adaptations, when we look at the neuromuscular adaptations now, remember that we have this spectrum of fiber types. You have your type 1 over here, which are your slow twitch, and you have your type 2 over here, which are your fast twitch. And there really exists a spectrum in between, right? So you have type 1, type 2, and you have all these intermediate fibers in between that have some characteristics, but the more you move to the right, the more tension you generate with the more fatigue, less endurance, and the more you move to the left, the more endurance, but low force. Now, type 1s do not convert to type 2, and type 2s do not convert to type 1. That does not happen. What does happen, though, is you get a shift from left to right. So depending upon the type of intensity that you're training, let's say you're doing a lot of high-intensity force type stuff, you'll get some lateral shifts to the right where these type 1s take on these type Cs, these intermediate, and these type 2As become type 2X. But these type 1s don't become these type 2. And the same thing for here. If you do a lot of endurance training, you'll get a shift to the left for more of your fast twitch are going to look like slow twitch. So again, these fibers are, if you're doing high intensity training, you'll see down here, you'll see these fibers kind of take on these characteristics and these fibers take on those, and so on. And you kind of get this shift to the right where you have more of a tendency to type 2 fibers. And if you're doing endurance type training, these ones aren't going to convert to these over here, but you'll see these fibers here kind of convert there, and these take on some of these characteristics through the adaptive process that we're seeing. So again, think of it as like this mushy middle that are more of your wild cards, and if you're training here, they're going to move more this direction, and if you're training here, they're going to move that direction. And if you look at, this is a chart from your book, you can see the muscle changes that will occur whether you're doing type 1 dominant training activities or type 2 dominant activities. And you can see here in the middle is your detrained, and as you would expect from doing high intensity training, you're going to see an increase in muscle growth, you're going to see fiber size increase, you'll see a rapid decrease in body fat, but you'll see some changes in aerobic enzymes because it's still oxidative, but and then the last thing you'll see is more strength and power. From over here with the endurance athletes, you're going to see an actual decrease in muscle size because type 1 fibers don't lend themselves to growth, and they're not really storing a lot of protein filaments. So you're actually going to see more of your type 2 fibers reduce. So you actually see a reduction in total muscle mass. When you get that reduction in muscle mass, you have what's left over is an increase in capillary density. So sometimes when people see this chart here, they'll see that you went from 3 to 2. They see this as a reduction, and it's not that you reduce capillaries. Your capillaries are actually growing. It's just that muscle growth happens so much faster that you get 2 times as much muscle growth as you do capillary improvement. So it actually ends result as less capillaries, relatively speaking, but absolutely still more. Same thing with the enzymes and mitochondria density. You're increasing muscle fibers that are anaerobic. They're not relying on mitochondria density. And so since you're getting this rapid increase in muscle tissue, you're getting so much muscle tissue that it's drowning out the aerobic enzymes, the capillary density, and the mitochondria. And as you would expect, you would see aerobic enzymes improving in the trained aspect. You'll see an improvement, somewhat improvement in short-term and distance. Your oxygen utilization becomes superstar, and because of that loss in muscle mass, you're going to lose strength and power, so your type 2 type activities. The articular system is the last on the tier, and as we talked in previous aspects, the connective tissue components, and but when you apply force to the bone, it's going to increase osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity, and you're going to see increased remodeling. And in this force is really important that your body needs that loading, unloading, these bending forces for those bones to develop. And as we'll talk about in age and age-related type aspect, you want those, you want that bone density to improve. In the articular system, you also have your collagen, and you have your ligaments and your bones, or your tendons, and they're made up of the same stuff. They have the collagen proteins here, and you can see a similar structure in the muscle, like the same with the muscle fibers. But you will see, because of the loading through, not so much in the ligament structure, but a lot in the tendon structure, because ligaments, bone to bone, you shouldn't really be loading the ligaments that much. There is some change that occurs, but if you're loading your ligaments, something's going on, and you shouldn't be loading your ligaments like you should. Ligaments are like the secondary support structures. Your muscles should be doing the primary component, but the tendons, they are a continuation of the muscle. As the muscle contracts, the tendon is loaded, so you will tend to see larger increases in tendons than you will in ligaments. And then lastly, we have our cardiovascular adaptations, and your body gets better at distributing resources to the working tissue. So your heart pumps better, your blood volume changes, your blood vessels are able to respond more appropriately, and so this whole blood distribution, getting the blood to the lungs, to the heart, and to the muscles, all improves through both acute and chronic use. So it's not just cardiovascular activity. Whether you're doing high intensity or low intensity, your heart is pumping blood to those working muscles. And so that's why cardiovascular, we'll talk about later, is not a good term for exercise. All exercise is cardiovascular, all exercise is resistance. We'll more on that later. But you remember this slide that the heart is responsible for getting blood flow to the tissues, the oxygenated blood, picking up waste product, delivering glucose and fatty acids, and also distributing hormones. And we have quite a bit of demand on the cardiovascular system, and a lot of the adaptations you see are at the heart itself with this cardiac output. Better stroke volume, better vascular tone. You get changes in blood volume. You can see the nervous system and hormones, they work more effectively. And in the end result is this better circulation of blood. Your respiration also increases. You have increased oxygen intake, and there's not much that's happening within the trachea or the lungs themselves. Where the improvements come from are in the diaphragmatic and the accessory muscles for breathing. So you get better ventilation, better volume of air coming in. And when we think of aerobic adaptations, when we get better with our running, we always think it's related to the cardiovascular or the breathing, and it is. But even at distance running, like marathon runners, the reason why they get better is also because the ability to load through the kinetic chain and the muscle adaptation and the ability to tolerate force is still good, is better, it improves. So your biomechanical efficiency, how well when you take a step and your muscles are able to tolerate that load, it's resistance exercise, but for the muscles, and instead of just 10 or 12 or 15 reps, it's 1,000 reps, right? 1,000 steps in that. And as you see from this chart here, you can see the physiology and the different outcomes for the heart, the cardiovascular aspect, pre and post, and you can see all of these things improve. Everything that's related to blood delivery or getting oxygen in the tissue improve. You see capillary density improve, you see skeletal muscle enzymes improve, anything to get oxygen into those tissues. And we'll close on this looking at cardio versus resistance exercise, aerobic versus anaerobic. So we'll close on this slide when we look at cardio versus resistance exercise as terms. And as I said, these are kind of bad terms because all exercise, whether it's high intensity or low intensity, whether you're sprinting or running, involves delivery of blood flow. You're always breathing. You're always in the aerobic system. You're occasionally supplementing with the anaerobic system, and you're always under the force of gravity. And so all exercise is cardiovascular. All exercise is resistance exercise. The terms aerobic and anaerobic are better. Aerobic tends to be related to cardio. Anaerobic tends to be with resistance exercise. But in the end, all of this is dependent upon low intensity versus high intensity. Intensity drives the energy system that you're in, and high intensity activities will force you into an anaerobic. You're never really in an aerobic or anaerobic. You're either aerobic always, and sometimes you're in an anaerobic state to supplement the aerobic, but you're never exclusively in an anaerobic aspect. So as long as you keep that in mind, that intensity is key, and that it's the higher intensity activities that recruit the metabolic and aspects and the hormonal aspects that we want. And also keep in mind that high intensity activity will recruit these type 2 fibers, but in order to recruit these type 2 fibers, you had to recruit these type 1. If you do lower intensity activity, you'll recruit these type 1 and you'll never touch these type 2 fibers. And so the higher intensity activities are inclusive. The lower intensity activities are exclusive. So if you're recruiting fibers over here, it is assumed that you've recruited all these fibers below that. And when we look at our adaptations, we're trying to get both. We're trying to improve our metabolic efficiency. We're looking at our muscle, our lean body mass. And, if we are looking at athletes that are trying to combine both, people trying to lose fat and work out at the same time, you get a lot of people that use cardio as their method for reducing body fat. And you can kind of see here that your trained individuals from resistance high intensity aspect tend to have lower body fat percentages than their endurance and trained. And it's because they have a significant reduction in the lean body mass, decreasing metabolic output. And so if you have athletes that are trying to preserve muscle tissue, so your size athletes or strength or any clients that are just trying to be bigger or want to have increased metabolism, you might want to reduce the amount of aerobic or low intensity long duration activity that you're doing. Now if they're a marathon runner and they are doing it for their sport, then so be it, that's what they're doing. But then they're going to want to increase their strength training, their resistance training, to try to counteract some of these effects of the loss of muscle. So combining resistance and aerobic endurance training may interfere with strength and power gains, as you can see here, right? And so, but the opposite's not true. If you have a endurance athlete that does some high intensity aspect, it's not going to negate any of the mitochondria or aerobic enzymes. In fact, because the high-intensity activity recruited the type 1, they're able to stimulate those tissues without having to do a lot of volume. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at program design. This chart here, which is from the book, really kind of showcases perfectly the adaptations that you're expecting with the increased lean body mass and the supportive adaptations that's happening.